Emily's mornings had become a ritual of exhaustion. Despite clocking in a full 8 hours of sleep, she awoke feeling as if she hadn't rested at all. Her limbs felt heavy, and a persistent ache settled in her lower back. These physical discomforts had no apparent cause. Her doctor attributed them to stress and prescribed mild painkillers, which offered only temporary relief. At work, Emily's concentration waned. Tasks that once took minutes now dragged on for hours. She found herself rereading emails and forgetting meeting details almost immediately after they concluded. Colleagues noticed her distraction, and while they offered assistance, Emily brushed it off, attributing it to being just a bit tired. Her evenings, once filled with hobbies and social interactions, became solitary. She declined invitations, preferring the comfort of her couch and the glow of the television. Cooking, an activity she once loved, felt burdensome. Meals became quick fixes, microwave dinners, or skipped altogether. Physically, Emily began experiencing frequent headaches and digestive issues. She consulted specialists, underwent tests, but results always returned normal. The lack of a medical diagnosis left her frustrated and confused. She began to question if these symptoms were all in her head. Sleep, once a refuge, turned restless. She struggled to fall asleep, and when she did, vivid dreams jolted her awake. Mornings brought no relief, only the dread of repeating the cycle. Emily's emotional state mirrored her physical decline. She felt detached, going through motions without genuine engagement. Moments of joy were fleeting, overshadowed by an unshakable sense of emptiness. One afternoon, while waiting for her prescription refill, Emily glanced at a pamphlet titled, "Is Your Body Telling You Something?" It listed signs like persistent fatigue, unexplained aches, and emotional numbness, all resonating with her experience. A realization dawned. Perhaps her body was signaling a need for emotional care, not just medical intervention. This chapter sets the stage for Emily's journey, highlighting the often overlooked physical manifestations of emotional distress. It underscores the importance of holistic well-being and the interconnectedness of mind and body. Emily barely noticed the turning of the seasons anymore. It was spring, supposedly, though the calendar felt meaningless. She still wore her gray coat every day, not because it was cold, but because it made her feel invisible. And invisibility had begun to feel safer than visibility. Her days followed a script. She woke up tired, dragged herself through a lukewarm shower, dressed in neutral tones, and walked the same 12-minute route to her office. She greeted the receptionist with a tight smile and took the stairs instead of the elevator, partly to avoid small talk, partly to convince herself she was still doing something healthy. Once she reached her desk, she logged in, checked her emails, and stared blankly at her screen. At first, the lack of focus had seemed temporary. Everyone had off days, but it had stretched into weeks, then months. Now, entire meetings went by without her absorbing a single word. She would nod in agreement, jot down notes she couldn't remember writing, and later stare at them, trying to decipher what she had committed to. Deadlines were met, but barely. She relied on old templates, recycled ideas, and the quiet hope that no one would notice she wasn't really there. Her body still ached, her lower back, neck, and sometimes her chest, like someone had tied a rope just below her ribs and was slowly pulling it tighter. The pills dulled the sensations, but they didn't make her feel better. They just made her feel nothing, and that nothing was spreading. Once upon a time, Emily had been someone who loved reading, baking on Sunday mornings, calling her sister on walks, even karaoke nights with her college friends. But those things required energy, emotion. Lately, everything felt like an obligation, even fun. Her guitar collected dust in the corner. The books on her nightstand sat unread, their bookmarks unmoved for weeks. Her Spotify playlists, once carefully curated, now played on silent shuffle. Background noise to her scrolling through news feeds she didn't really care about. She still answered texts, but the responses were short. "Sorry, super busy. Rain check. LOL, yeah." She didn't lie, exactly, but she didn't say the truth either. That she felt hollow, that she wanted to care but didn't, that her world had lost its color and all she could see was beige. At work, her coworker Nisha stopped by her desk one afternoon. She carried a box of cookies, store-bought, but in a cute tin. "You okay?" Nisha asked gently, placing the tin down. "You seem kind of off. Like not just tired." "I don't mean to pry." Emily looked up with what she hoped was a convincing smile. "Oh, just one of those months. Too many deadlines." Nisha didn't push, just nodded. But she lingered for a moment before walking away. The interaction rattled Emily more than she expected. It was the first time someone had named what she'd tried to hide under routines, polite emails, and automatic smiles. It made her feel both seen and exposed. Later that night, she sat at her kitchen table, the cookie tin unopened beside her laptop. She stared at a blinking cursor in an empty document. She was supposed to write a proposal for a client launch. Normally, she would have had the slides half ready by now. But nothing came. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had an original thought. Something that excited her, something that made her feel competent or even just alive. Without thinking, she stood up and went to the medicine cabinet. Her anxiety pills sat on the second shelf, right next to the unused vitamins and expired eye drops. She held the bottle in her hand for a long moment before twisting off the cap. She wasn't in the middle of a panic attack, but the discomfort was growing, an invisible tightness that started in her shoulders and made its way down her spine. She took a pill and washed it down with a gulp of water. Then another, even though she knew she wasn't supposed to. Her prescription was as needed, not daily. But lately, needed felt constant. That night, the pill smoothed her over. She didn't cry. She didn't think. She simply floated above her exhaustion, mentally distant from everything that might have otherwise kept her awake. The next morning, she regretted it. Her body was slow, heavy. Her thoughts moved like syrup. She overslept her alarm, skipped breakfast, and barely made it to her meeting on time. During the call, her manager asked her a direct question. Emily didn't even register it until the silence grew thick enough that someone else answered for her. She forced out a quick sorry. My mic wasn't working, but she could feel the heat rise to her face. That afternoon, she looked up the side effects of the medication again, even though she already knew them. Drowsiness, reduced coordination, emotional flattening, dependence. She scrolled through forums, people talking about the same dull fog she was feeling. Some said they eventually adjusted. Others said the fog never lifted. She wasn't sure which group she was in. She wasn't even sure what she was hoping to find. A few days later, she found herself sitting at a coffee shop, pretending to read a book while her friend Olivia sat across from her, stirring her latte. Olivia had insisted they meet up, saying it had been way too long. Emily had run out of excuses. "I missed you," Olivia said. "I'm glad you came." Emily nodded. "Yeah, me too." There was a pause. Then Olivia tilted her head slightly and said, "It's okay if you're not okay. You don't have to pretend with me." It was the gentleness in her voice that almost broke Emily. She stared at the foam in her cup, blinking back a sudden sting behind her eyes. She hadn't cried in months, not out of strength, but out of disconnection. She didn't know how to explain the silence inside her, the numbness, the way her body kept moving, but her heart hadn't caught up. She didn't cry that day either, but she didn't lie. "I think I'm not doing great," she admitted softly. Olivia nodded, like she'd been waiting for that sentence. "Do you want to talk to someone? I know a therapist I really liked. I can text you her info if you want." Emily hesitated. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. That night, she sat in bed and typed the therapist's name into a search bar. She didn't make an appointment. She just read the profile, then read it again, then closed the browser. The following week, her doctor called to check in. Routine follow-up. Emily almost lied, said she was feeling better. But instead, she asked, "Do you think I should be seeing someone?" Not for the medication, for the rest of it. There was a pause. Then her doctor said, "Honestly, yes, I do." It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a fix, but it was something. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months. Relief. Not because the numbness was gone, but because maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Emily had always prided herself on holding things together. It was her quiet superpower, being the reliable one, the one who responded to emails promptly remembered birthdays, double-checked the calendar, and showed up even when she didn't want to. So when she started therapy, it was with the same mindset. Show up, take notes, figure it out, and get better. But therapy didn't feel like a task to complete. It felt like standing in front of a mirror that didn't lie. Her first session with Dr. Karen Holmes was over Zoom. The office had a waiting list for in-person appointments, and Karen had a calm, unhurried presence that made the screen feel a little less like a barrier. Emily wasn't even sure what she'd expected. Some dramatic moment, perhaps. Instead, it was quiet. Kind. Tell me a little about what brought you here, Karen asked gently. Emily stared into her webcam. I don't really know. I just don't feel anything anymore. Or if I do, it's like it's all muffled. Karen nodded, as though this wasn't strange at all. And how long has it felt like that? Emily paused. I think a long time. But it got worse in the last few months. The truth sat in the space between them. The first few sessions didn't unlock anything obvious. Emily talked about her job, her fatigue, her body aches. Karen asked about her childhood, her friendships, her family. It was more tiring than Emily expected, having to explain things she barely understood herself. But she kept showing up. Something about the regularity of it, about knowing there was a place she could go and not have to pretend, was quietly anchoring. Still, the change wasn't immediate. Outside the sessions, Emily's life continued in the same foggy routine. Work was harder now that she'd become aware of how little joy it brought her. Even the distraction of productivity had lost its appeal. She found herself zoning out in meetings more often, snapping back to reality with a flutter of panic when someone said her name. Then came the grocery store. It was a normal Tuesday evening. She stopped at the market on her way home, planning to pick up almond milk and some vegetables. She walked down the fluorescent-lit aisles, distracted, scrolling through her mental list. It was nothing unusual. The store was half empty. The air smelled faintly of citrus and freezer burn. And then it hit. Out of nowhere, her heart started pounding. Her palms went clammy. Her legs felt like they couldn't hold her up. The lights suddenly seemed too bright, the shelves too tall, the space too loud and too small all at once. She could feel her breath coming short and fast, and the thought gripped her. I'm not okay. I can't be here. I have to get out. She left the basket in the middle of the aisle and walked straight out of the store, barely registering the stairs. Outside, the cold air hit her face, and she leaned against the wall, closing her eyes, counting her breaths. 4 in, 6 out. Something Karen had taught her. 4 in, 6 out. It took 10 minutes before her heart slowed down. She stood there, arms crossed, shaking slightly as people passed by. No one asked if she was okay. And part of her was grateful. She didn't want to explain. How could she explain? When she got home, she cried. Not the quiet, movie scene kind of crying, but full-bodied, heaving sobs that left her curled up on the floor beside her bed. She hadn't cried like that in years. It wasn't just about the panic attack. It was about everything. About how hard she'd worked to keep it all together, how exhausted she was, how scared she was that this might never end. The next day, she told Karen what had happened. Karen didn't look surprised. It's actually very common, she said gently. When you start addressing things emotionally, when you stop suppressing, it can feel like the body is finally allowed to speak. And it sometimes screams. Emily gave a weak laugh. It felt more like a fire alarm than a scream. They spent the next several sessions unpacking that moment. Not just the panic attack, but what led to it. The guilt she carried for feeling unproductive. The way she'd internalized being the strong one for so long that the very idea of needing help felt like failure. The grief she hadn't fully processed from her mother's passing 3 years ago. Grief that had quietly slipped under her skin and settled into her muscles, her stomach, her sleep. One session, Karen asked a question that caught her off guard. When was the last time you were kind to yourself? Emily blinked. What do you mean? I mean really kind. Not just checking a box like I went for a walk, but something from a place of love, of gentleness. Emily sat in silence. She couldn't remember. Karen leaned in slightly. That tells me a lot. In the weeks that followed, Karen asked her to start journaling, not about tasks or goals, but about emotions. Emily resisted at first. She wasn't a journal person, but one night, after another restless attempt to sleep, She opened a blank notebook and wrote, "I feel like I'm disappearing." The pen kept moving after that. The more she wrote, the more she uncovered. Small memories, forgotten fears, the way she'd learned, growing up, that crying made people uncomfortable. That asking for help meant being a burden. That success was the only thing that guaranteed love, or at least attention. One journal entry ended with, "What if I've never really learned how to feel things fully? Just learned how to manage them?" Slowly, she began practicing something Karen called emotional witnessing. It meant noticing her feelings without immediately judging or fixing them. When she felt sad, she didn't have to push it down. When she felt angry, she didn't have to explain it away. It was strange at first. Sitting with emotion instead of avoiding, it felt like walking through a burning room without running. But she was learning that she could survive the heat. One evening, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror and said out loud, "You're allowed to feel this." She said it twice, then again. Her voice cracked on the third time, and that was when she knew she was beginning to change, not dramatically, not in a movie ending kind of way, but in the smallest, most important way. She was giving herself permission. She still had bad days, still woke up feeling flat or anxious. But now, she didn't immediately reach for the pills. She'd spoken with her doctor about reducing her dosage slowly, under supervision, and started spacing them out when she felt stable. Instead of numbing the discomfort, she began learning to listen to it. She also started setting small boundaries, telling her boss she needed more realistic deadlines, saying no to social events when she truly needed rest, even telling her sister she couldn't talk that night, but would call tomorrow. These weren't huge changes, but they felt like small acts of rebellion against the person she used to be, the one who put everyone else's needs first and called it strength. One afternoon, she returned to the grocery store. Same aisle, same lighting. But this time, she paused, took a breath, and said quietly, "I'm safe." She finished shopping, not triumphantly, not fearlessly, but fully present. On the way home, she called Olivia. "I think I'm getting better," she said. There was a pause. Then Olivia replied, "I'm proud of you." Emily smiled, not because things were perfect, but because for the first time in a long time, she believed they could be better. And that was enough. Healing didn't come with fireworks or grand declarations. It came in the smallest of ways. It came in the pause before Emily reached for her medication, in the decision to open the window in the morning and let in the air, in how she stopped rushing through her days as though they were hurdles. Recovery wasn't a destination. It was a rhythm she was learning to dance to, imperfectly and with effort. The morning light began to look different. Maybe it was the same, but something in her was shifting. She still had days where she woke up with the weight of fatigue sitting on her chest, but now she understood it wasn't laziness or failure. It was information. It was her body's way of asking her to slow down, to tune in, to pay attention. In therapy, Karen encouraged her to stop measuring her progress by productivity. What if healing isn't about doing more, but feeling more? She asked one afternoon, when Emily had arrived frustrated that she hadn't accomplished anything all week. At first, the idea felt foreign. Emily had lived in the metrics of progress for most of her adult life. Project completion, task lists, promotions. Even her social life was measured. How many texts replied to, how often she reached out. Now, she was learning to notice different markers. Did I breathe deeply today? Did I let myself feel sad without apologizing? Did I say no to something that would have drained me? And she was starting to answer yes, more often than she used to. She didn't become someone else. She was still Emily, still thoughtful, still organized, still the one who made reservations and double-check plans. But she began softening into herself. There was less urgency in her movements, more curiosity in her thoughts. She walked more often, not as a way to get steps in, but to notice things, how the trees changed shape throughout the week, the smell of bread from the bakery 2 blocks over, the laughter of kids on their way to school. One day, she bumped into Nisha on her walk home. They hadn't talked much since that afternoon with the cookie tin. "You look lighter," Nisha said with a smile. "I don't know how else to describe it." Emily smiled back. "I think I am." They got coffee the next weekend, and for the first time in what felt like years, Emily found herself laughing. Not politely, but with her whole body. Her laugh surprised even her, and she realized how long it had been since joy had come without effort. Work didn't magically transform into a passion project, but Emily started speaking up more. She asked to shift her role slightly, leaning more into creative strategy and away from logistics. Her boss, perhaps sensing her change, was surprisingly receptive. She didn't feel cured, but she felt agency again, like she had permission to choose what fit and what didn't. And she began reconnecting with people, but also with herself. One weekend, she dusted off her guitar. The strings were loose, the case smelled faintly of attic, but her fingers still remembered the chords. She played quietly at first, then louder, then with the window open. A neighbor called up from below. "Sounds nice." She blushed but didn't stop playing. She called her sister more often, and for the first time, shared the truth about the past few months. About the panic attack. About therapy. About how hard it had been to admit she wasn't okay. Her sister didn't offer advice. Just listened. "I'm proud of you," she said. "You know, I always thought you were strong, but I think this is the strongest I've ever seen you." Emily cried after that call, but it was the kind of crying that felt like opening a door, not shutting one. Like clearing space. One morning, she woke up before her alarm. She made coffee, opened her journal, and wrote one sentence. "I don't need to be perfect to be okay." She underlined it twice. Karen had once told her that emotional healing was like rehab. Painful, slow, often invisible to the outside world. You're retraining yourself to respond instead of react, to feel instead of flee. It's not flashy, but it's real. Emily was beginning to believe that. She still had anxiety. It didn't vanish, but she knew how to greet it now, not with panic, but with understanding. "Okay," she would think when her chest tightened. "Something in me feels unsafe. Let's find out what." Sometimes the answer was simple: too much caffeine, too little sleep. Sometimes it was deeper: a lingering memory, an old insecurity triggered. But she was no longer afraid of asking the question. That she knew was growth. The medication stayed in her cabinet, reduced now to the lowest dose and taken only when truly needed. Her doctor continued to check in, supportive of her cautious tapering. Emily knew that medication wasn't weakness, just one piece of care. But what had once been her only tool was now one of many. She had breathing exercises. She had therapy. She had people she could talk to. She had herself. One evening, she returned to the grocery store. Yes, that grocery store. And this time she walked through it calmly. She paused in the same aisle where the panic had first hit. The overhead lights flickered slightly. The music playing was soft and forgettable. But Emily stood still and smiled. She didn't feel triggered. She didn't feel victorious, either. She felt steady. That was enough. At the checkout, the clerk asked, "How's your day going?" Emily surprised herself. "It's been a good one," she said. And she meant it. Back at home, she made herself dinner. A real one, with color and flavor. She played music. She lit a candle. She ate slowly. These small rituals had become sacred. Not for show, but for her. After dinner, she called Olivia. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on me when I went quiet." Olivia laughed. "You never scare me, Em. You just needed a little time to hear yourself again." And she had. Finally, she had. That night, before bed, she wrote one last thing in her journal. She didn't plan it. The sentence arrived on its own, and she let it land. Healing wasn't loud, but it was mine. Then she closed the journal, turned out the light, and let the quiet settle around her, not as a weight, but as peace.